Thank you everybody for coming. I'm gonna talk to you about my PhD research, but I'm not going to give you a whole picture of my PhD research today because there just isn't enough time to cover it. And in the spirit of the conference and the conference themes, what I really wanted to focus on are just two methodological aspects in my research because there are two ways in which I am employing creative methods into my research. So I'll just talk about those primarily. Oh, there we go. Okay, so I'm just going to very briefly go over some key background I think you need to have to understand the study and what purpose the metaphors that I'm going to talk about and the cartoon storyboard drawings will have in the research overall. So just some very quick background. Watch me try to be really concise today, given that I know we're running a few minutes late. A little bit limited on time. So as Deirdre mentioned, I used to be a Spanish teacher back in the States. And when I entered the field of language teaching for the first time, I believed that using target language, which in my case was Spanish as a Spanish teacher, was using it as much as possible was best practice. And in fact, in the school that I taught in, using at least 90% of Spanish, 90% of the time was thought to be best practice. And then that other 10% could be allocated to using L1 or first language, which in my case in the US was English. English was the first language shared among the students. So I went in thinking, right, 90% Spanish all the time, here we go, I'm gonna use target language, and quickly found that to be really difficult to achieve. It's not always best for the students. And in my case, the students were middle school aged, which is about 11, 12, 13. It caused quite a bit of anxiety. It impacted on my relationships with the students. And so when I did my master's and I interviewed my former colleagues at the school, I found that we generally shared the same sentiments about using 90% target language. It was frustrating. So I found it really interesting in my research that, and I know there's a lot of text on this slide, you don't need to worry about all that. What I want to draw your attention to are just the headings on each of these columns, because from left to right, they kind of show my evolution of thinking on target language use and on first language use. So whereas I entered the classroom as a first-year teacher thinking 90% target language is great, as I read and as I began to gain a more critical approach to that, I realized actually it's not maybe necessarily best practice. And so through my reading and through development of my understanding, I began to question whether using target language necessarily has to come at the expense of L1, and theories within translanguaging place much more importance on the L1 and on using students' whole linguistic repertoires, all the languages in their arsenal, bringing them together rather than limiting one or the other. And so starting to push away from monolingual norms. And while translanguaging sounds really great, I also found that it's maybe not super applicable in my language learning context, because in the US, in the classrooms I was teaching in, there's still very much predominant monolingual norms. And what I mean by that is students tend to be native speakers of English, and English being such a dominant language, it's really kind of hard to break away from that. And so English takes quite a bit more dominance over any other languages. And so translanguaging, I wasn't really seeing how I could apply that because their linguistic backgrounds are still very monolingual and a bit limited. So That's kind of where I'm at in terms of my current research. And I don't know yet, what the perfect approach is, what the perfect answer is to how we teach languages to English speakers, and how we continue to place importance on their L1, but how do we also continue to get English speakers speaking more target language? Because as we know, this is really difficult to do in contexts where English is a first language. And so if we look at the UK, for example, so there's this article by Landvers and Coleman, and they describe what's happening language-wise, language learning-wise in the UK to be a crisis. Languages are in decline. Fewer pupils are signing up to learn languages. And I think one of the primary reasons for that is, given that their first language is English, because it is so widely used, they may feel that there isn't really much of a need for them to be learning other languages. So what I want to do is to kind of apply those theories about L1 and target language use into these contexts, to see, what's going on in classrooms in terms of the target language use. And given the really low uptake in languages in the UK, is there any sort of connection between what's happening in terms of the language use practices and how that may or may not be impacting on students' desire to continue learning languages? And we heard a bit about yesterday during Louise's opening speech about the 1+2 language initiative, which is taking place in Scotland. And so we've got mandatory language learning in Scotland up until about midway through secondary school, but students are still continuing to drop languages after a certain point. And so that brings me to what I'm going to be focusing on. And on this slide, you'll see I've brought two research questions to your attention, and I've kind of faded the other two because now I'm just going to talk about kind of one side, one aspect of my study, and that is focusing on pupils' attitudes, Scottish pupils' attitudes specifically, about the languages used in their classroom and how they feel about language learning. And now I'm going to talk about the fun stuff, which is how I am investigating that. So, oh, and here's just a little bit of background info on the pupils and where they're coming from, which is across the central belt of Scotland. And what I've decided to do is particularly explore the first 3 years of secondary school before they reach that point where they're able to make the decision to drop languages or continue languages. So that tends to be around ages 12 to 15. And then predominantly they are learning French, German, and a little bit of Spanish as well. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is the way that I'm using metaphors in my research. And we heard Suzanne Graham talk a little bit about this. And she mentioned one of her colleagues, Linda Fisher, who's been a huge inspiration in my decision to use metaphors. So Linda Fisher conducted this fabulous study where she used metaphors with English students to get a wider sense of their attitudes about learning German. Oh, sorry. Oh gosh, how do I go back? There we go. And so here are a few examples of some of the metaphors that those students came up with. So she posed them a sentence stem, and that sentence stem is learning German is like, and they had a lot of freedom and creativity to finish that sentence. And so one of my favorite examples, I think for obvious reasons, is learning German is like getting a spider to fart through its ears. And then what do we do with that, right? What does that mean? So what Linda Fisher determined, she thematically categorized these metaphors. And so in that first chunk of examples, those are all examples of where students expressed learning German as something difficult or even impossible, like getting a spider to fart through its ears. Another example I like just below that is learning German is like a hamster running on its wheel, which she categorized as learning German as drudgery, right? Like a hamster just going on its wheel, never stopping. And some other categories that she came up with were learning German as mystery, as surmountable challenge, as exertion or struggle, as pleasure, and as physical suffering. So notably, there are quite a few more negative categories here than positive categories. So I was interested to see whether I would find the same kind of results in my research. So here are, I've got the research question there on the left-hand side, just to kind of remind you what the purpose of these metaphors are. And so building off of what Linda Fisher did, I wanted to make sure that what I was eliciting from my students was in the form of a metaphor, but at the same time still answering my specific question, which is, what do they think about first language use, and what do they think about target language use in their language classrooms? So I slightly reworded some of the sentence stems to speaking French is like ... And then I also gave them this because clause to expand on their thinking and to help me interpret their thinking correctly. And then I also gave them the sentence stem using English in, let's say, French classes like blah, 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 because. So here are some examples from my own pupils. I'll just kind of pause for 10 seconds to let you read through some of those. So I can see some of Linda Fisher's categories applying to my own metaphors, like learning languages like Monopoly, because there are always hidden rules you're sure you've never heard of. So I thought that sounds a bit like learning French or language as mystery, right? There's all these hidden rules. And then in the middle column there, speaking language is like shoving 5 baguettes into your mouth because it's impossible. So that speaks to Linda Fisher's category, difficulty, impossibility. That's how they see speaking. This example was French. And then in that last column, I quite like the first example. They're using English in French classes like Iron Brew on holiday, because it's a familiar break from the confusion and somewhat chaos. So that brings me to my own analysis of these metaphors. And so you'll kind of see in this table where I'm using some inspiration from Linda Fisher in terms of how to categorize these, but then also thinking about from my own examples, what new categories might be coming up, particularly since I've reworded these metaphors, sentence stems slightly. And so I think it's open to new themes to emerge in new categories. And so I circled an example for you to have a look at there, which is using English in French classes like staying up past midnight on a school night because you know you probably shouldn't, but you still like doing it. And I thought this kind of sounded like taboo, right? Using English in the language classroom, something you shouldn't be doing. Why does the student have that perception about it, that it's something they shouldn't be doing, but something they like to do? So kind of going back to those earlier perceptions of squashing the first language out of the classroom. And it seems like maybe those kinds of practices are still taking place in these classrooms. So that's the metaphors. And now I'll just briefly talk about the cartoon storyboard drawings that I'm using. And so where these have been inspired from, in addition to Annelies Kuster's language portraits, which we heard about yesterday, I've also gathered inspiration from Sylvia Mello-Pfeiffer, who I've got a picture of one of her examples on the left-hand side here from one of her papers. Sorry. Deirdre, just give me a heads up if I'm going too long. I'll try to speed it up.
I think just a couple more minutes.
Yeah,
Does that feel okay?
Yeah, that's totally fine. So Sylvia Mello-Pfeiffer uses language portraits or drawings to let students express their different linguistic repertoires. And so you'll see an example here of a multilingual student on the left whose languages include Portuguese, German, French, English. And I wanted to use something similar. I wanted to use a drawing aspect in my research because I thought there were so many benefits to it, like showing me how they perceive themselves to relate to the languages that they have or the languages that they're learning, But then I also wanted to see more about, from their perspective, what's actually happening in the classroom in terms of how languages are used and how that's impacting on their own self-awareness of themselves as language learners and language speakers, and what's happening in the classroom in terms of their own experiences. And so that brings me to my second research question directed towards the pupils, which is, what do their accounts of what's happening in the language learning environment tell us about the languages that are being used, and then their own experiences overall and their attitudes about language learning in general. So I thought I'll take that drawing aspect, and what I'll do is I'll ask them to make a cartoon, so to kind of depict a story of what's taking place in the classroom. So here's an example of the first scene I asked them to draw. I wanted to give them freedom to be creative, but I also wanted to give them some structure. And so in the first scene, I ask the student to depict the teacher and what languages the teacher is using. And so what I'll show you next is a full example, and you can see the other 3 scenes that I ask students to do. And so here's a complete example. So you see the first scene there where I've asked them to depict their teacher. And the second scene, I've asked them to depict themselves. So what languages are they using? What are they doing in the classroom? In the third, I asked them to portray what's happening with the whole class and their classmates, what's happening around them in terms of the languages being used and how they're being used. And then finally, I asked them to kind of draw me an introspective picture of how they're feeling, what they're thinking while they're in the class. So I had a few examples to show you, but I know I'm just about out of time. So I'll just point out a couple details about this example and finish off. So you see that the teacher uses mostly English, but adds a bit of French. You see that the pupil in the second scene tends to chat in a mix of French and English. There's a lot of color, there's happiness portrayed in this comic, in this cartoon storyboard. So there's French being used, and it seems to be being used in a positive way. In the third scene, the classroom is depicted as chaotic, and there's a lot of chit chat in predominantly English, which is perhaps to be expected. And then interestingly, in the fourth scene, the student is kind of torn in the middle between feeling that it's easy, enjoying French, but at the same time, kind of nerves and anxiety. What if I get picked? How do I say that? So the target language is also creating feelings of anxiety. So I'll skip the other couple of examples I was going to go through and just bring you to my kind of sum up slide. And summing it all up together, I don't have any answers for you yet in terms of the research questions, because I've just started analyzing the data, and these are just kind of, these are the first examples that I've had coming out of my data. So it's great that I have those examples to show you. This is how I'm using some creative methods in my research. Hopefully next year I'll have more to tell you about what it actually means and how it's actually answering the research questions. But overall, the big question is, how are languages being used in the classroom, and what impact is this may or may not be having on Scottish people's experiences of language overall, and on this kind of language decline problem that we have taking place. So I'll stop it there. Thank you very, very much for listening. And yeah.